Extracts from the 688th official contact meeting on the 20th of August 2017.
But what do you actually think about all the storms that keep coming over Europe and Eurasia? Something can be done against them to avoid even worse damage caused by these tremendous storms.
It is too late for that, because the time has come that the old prophecies have already announced, but that your and my father's predictions in the 1940s and 1950s have also set out, as well as your multiple warnings to governments and media all over the world, whereupon you were insulted only as a fantasist and a do-gooder and a weirdo and a madman. Until the beginning of the 1970s, there would have been time enough to introduce the necessary measures in the form of a worldwide birth stop and a comprehensive and also worldwide rigorous birth control, as well as to end the destructive machinations in nature, but nothing of the kind was done. All the destruction of nature since the 1940s and 1950s has resulted from the machinations of the unstoppably growing overpopulation, which demanded more and more destructive interventions in nature and caused tremendous changes in it, which ultimately led to the climate overthrow, the effects of which are very diverse and have not yet been fully recognized by scientists. The destruction of forests and oceans, for example, impairs oxygen production, as a result of which the oxygen content is sinking throughout the planet, with glaciers and poles melting extremely rapidly worldwide and permafrost dissolving very rapidly, causing methane gases to rise into the atmosphere in many areas. In addition to these facts, more and more damaging factors are appearing, leading to severe disasters, especially in alpine areas, as will be the case in Switzerland next week. In this respect, as has been apparent for a long time and as has been warned, a large part of the Bregaglia will be detached from Piz Cengalo by the dissolution of the permafrost and fall deep down into the valley, which will happen several times in succession. Although such an event is not uncommon in mountainous Switzerland, such occurrences will increase in the future as a result of this event, which will take place next week and will repeat itself several times in succession and also cost several lives. Further crashes will occur even after 1 week and more in the same area. But there will be many more descents in Switzerland and all over the world in other countries around the world, which will be absolutely unavoidable. The same has always happened in various countries, but in the coming times the whole thing will increase extremely due to the permafrost dissolution, as it will also be with the storms, which will constantly spread to the whole earth. This, too, will become apparent in a few days' time, in America in the state of Texas, where an exorbitant hurricane, which, at around 250 hours, will far exceed all that has been experienced in those areas, is causing enormous damage and destruction that goes far beyond what was caused by Hurricane Katrina in Alabama, Louisiana and Cuba from the 23rd to 31st of August 2005. Around 1850 people died at that time, but hurricane next week will not result in this large number of deaths, but will be much lower, but the material destruction etc. will be much greater and more devastating than Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In total, more than 100,000 houses will be destroyed. In addition to the fact that the storm will bring huge rainstorms, these will still cause immense and devastating floods even after the storm has subsided, and human lives will also be lost. This will also affect the state of Louisiana, but to a lesser extent, while in Asia and South Asia, however, monsoon weather will cause catastrophic conditions and cost many lives, the number of which will reach several thousand by the end of the monsoon season. China and various other Asian countries will also be hit by violent storms that have surpassed everything that has happened in Europe to date. But also Africa and Australia etc. will not be spared from thunderstorms and unusual rain masses, whereby also human lives will be to deplore.
Yes, the warnings were not listened to at the time. And with regard to what is coming next week in America, it has to be said that for the majority of those affected the whole thing will be particularly bitter and hard. because in the USA there are no assurances for such natural occurrences from homeowners, etc., so they will be effectively left with nothing as a result of the destruction of their houses. The US American government has not been able for a long time, and still is not today, by law, to issue compulsory building insurance for homeowners, as we have here in the canton of Zurich. The building insurance of the canton of Zurich is called GVZ for short and corresponds to a Swiss building insurance policy through which all house owners of the canton of Zurich are insured against fire, natural hazards and earthquake damage under the obligatory building insurance. GVZ was founded in 1808 and exists as an independent public institution of the canton. The GVZ is subject to the ultimate supervision of the Zurich Cantonal Council, which is also responsible for approving the annual report and the financial statements, although the Zurich Government Council exercises general supervision and also determines the scope of estimates and the external auditors. The Board of Directors, which consists of 7 members, primarily performs supervisory tasks. The Board of Directors is officially composed of the responsible Board of Directors of the Cantonal Directorate of Justice and Home Affairs and is responsible for the building insurance institution. In addition to the Government Council, the board also includes 6 members elected by the Government Council from the circle of homeowners, municipalities and business, although the management of the GVZ is the responsibility of the management. However, it has to be said that, to my knowledge, the mandatory need for building insurance is unfortunately not regulated throughout Switzerland within this framework, which is why it is extremely urgent that all governments of all Swiss cantons should take care that all buildings, at least and specifically the residential buildings, would have to be fully insured without pardon. Private building insurance, which is offered by various insurers, should also exist in addition to the cantonal building insurance, because they also contribute financially in the event of damage, which means that damage can be covered more extensively financially.
You are well oriented, but that must be the case for your center management task.
Yeah, you're right, because being informed about these things is part of my job. Task. But now a question about what we have been talking about during all the days of our work, on which partly Jana and Florina were also involved, which I have still not put forward, namely about all the conversations we've had during the 4 nights that every night sometimes lasted up to 4 hours. Is it necessary to retrieve and write them down? Because the whole thing would be a
work you don't have to burden yourself with unnecessarily. Although we have recorded everything, as has always been the case, the conversations held are not relevant for calling them up as official conversation reports and recording them in writing. So we'll keep it the same way as with any unofficial contact talks that you don't have to call up and don't have to write down, but are only recorded by us.
As this also refers to all the conversations that arise during private visits. If that were not the case, then I would be so burdened with retrieval and writing that I could do nothing else and would have to leave all the other work behind, but we have already discussed this earlier. But I want to come back to the enormous storm in the USA with enormous destruction, because such storms will increase in the coming time and also become ever more enormous, as I know, like all other catastrophes, which will also occur everywhere on Earth ever more frequently.
That will be the case, and the next major hurricane is already looming at its source, and it will develop at the beginning of the first days in September and is likely to be more powerful than the one we have been talking about.
Can't be otherwise. What interests me, however, is the expulsion of 755 diplomats from Russia, to which I believe that this was perhaps truly welcomed by the President of the United States, and in keeping with his purpose, but for which all the anti-Russians around him will take revenge in the government. Donald Trump thanked Putin for the expulsion of the diplomats, saying that the US would save a lot of money. Trump saw the whole thing quite positively that Russia carried the US diplomats out of the country. Trump said that the expulsion would reduce the salary costs for the US very much and that a lot of money would be saved. So he wanted to thank the US for now having a smaller payroll, and there was no reason for the expelled embassy staff to return to Russia. It was the end of July. I think that Putin, in response to new US sanctions against Russia, ordered a total of 755 employees in the American embassy in Moscow and in the US consulates had to leave the country. The morbidly stupid US sanctions were devised and imposed as a result of the alleged Russian pro-Trump hacker attacks in the US election campaign and the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. The fact is that Putin's decision, which I believe to be justified, to kick out the diplomats, in fact, further strains the already tense relationship with the USA. And as it is in the USA, the US powers that really rule behind Trump are working and will not simply accept the whole thing of expulsion of diplomats. And that the president is directed and turned upside down by the effective rulers behind him, so that he dances to their violins, which Trump obviously doesn't realize, or maybe he just cushions, that's clear. Consequently, I assume that a setback against Russia is being planned against Trump's will by these background US governments, or by the real rulers behind Trump, according to the US revenge system. As you tell me, I'll tell you even more. I think it could also be an expulsion of diplomats, but it could also be US government terrorist actions against other Russians and businessmen and Russian companies, etc. in the US. Such a step by the US government, against Trump's will, is probably to be expected, I think, as the USA did under Trump's predecessor Barack Obama, who had reduced the number of Russian diplomats by 35 and closed 2 Russian recreation centers in the USA. Obama, too, took a vow in his election that he would do everything in his power, but he could hardly do anything about it, because, as has always been the case with all US presidents, and will continue to be the case, and consequently also with Trump, he had to let the people behind him determine everything and he had to become unfaithful to practically all his election promises and completely failed. Perhaps he can actually get through a few of his election promises, such as the unpleasant thing about the construction of the wall on the Mexican border, as well as the sans-papiers immigrants, or those who migrated to the USA without identity papers and their descendants, who are said to be just over 1 million, as you told me at Trump's election trombonary. And so, as I see it, it will be with Trump as a whole as it is with all US presidents, as well as with practically all the world's powers, that he will not be able to keep his effectively good and valuable, grandiose election promises, because those behind him who really have the governmental power are reversing his polarity and, according to their will, forcing him to do what they really want. They are also following him and preventing him from doing the good, right and valuable that he wanted to do with election promises. And that is precisely where I see the great hostility towards Russia and the hatred of all the background governments and those sections of the people who want to turn Russia into a US vassal state in the US manner.
You see this in the right way, because in fact it will soon become clear that your words will become reality, because the rulers behind US President Trump, as you call the leading rulers who really exercise US government power, are already drawing up anti-Russian political intrigue plans to avenge the expulsion of US diplomats from Russia. You recently told me that you would call Trump a clumsy because of his clumsy, bumpy and rude behavior, because he behaves clumsy, but it must be remembered that he is not diplomatically trained and therefore speaks freely as he sees and understands everything.
Which is actually more honest than dishonest diplomacy.
That is probably true, but it creates enemies of all those who like lies and deception more than the truth, because they do not know how to use their intelligence and therefore can neither perceive the facts in a real way nor understand them correctly. Therefore they are not able to perceive something said or simply arising facts in the given way, and also cannot think about it, so that they can see through the whole thing in their correctness, really realize and decipher what is to be called effective stupidity. Unfortunately, this is also true of the majority of US citizens who believe in and are addicted to the government, who make those in power think for themselves because they themselves are incapable of doing so.
If what is given is not heard correctly and is not perceived correctly and then misunderstood and twisted, then, I think, this is not only a factor of inattention, but also a fact of lacking intelligence, or precisely that underdeveloped intelligence is not used in a good and expedient framework.
That is probably the case, but we have got off the subject, because I wanted to make it clear that in the coming period, and also in the coming weeks, political hostility will arise against Russia in the United States, which will have very unpleasant consequences. The soot, hostile to the country, and the foolhardy imprudence of the majority of US governments are not only extremely regrettable, but extremely primitive, reckless, unreasonable and full of danger, which in the coming weeks will be exacerbated by the confused dictator Kim Jong-un in North Korea, because no conciliation efforts are being undertaken by the Americans, as reason would require.
I agree with that. But it can also be said that Kim Jong-un is a megalomaniac and full of hatred against the USA, and who doesn't know what deadly madness he is pursuing, and believes that he could defeat the USA and the US allies. He is completely insane, as are the powerful Americans, who in their megalomania believe that they can stand up to the North Korean dictator's madness with idiotic threats. The guy is not to be understood, because what he learned in Switzerland or in Bern, where he studied for years under a false name, was certainly not hammered into his dictatorship. But what I would like to address now, which we have talked about before, is that another time a visitor asked a member of the Kilograms whether another member of the Kilograms had already had contact with one of you players, which of course had to be denied. There was also the question recently raised by visitors whether your players would one day establish open contacts with the world's leaders. If you have something to say about this that has already arisen with regard to both questions?
I can, yes. For core group members, the possibility of personal contact with us was effectively considered. As you yourself know, and you also wanted to make an effort to create the necessary possibility. However, the whole thing was made impossible by the incredibly unreasonable and sometimes even malicious quarrels of various Kilograms members, which meant that the whole thing had to be declared impossible and declared impracticable for all time. And this will remain for all times to come, as well as that we players will finally withdraw from the earth after your end of life. And as for the question as to whether we will make contact with earthly leaders of state, this is also absolutely clear, namely that we will not do this under any circumstances, neither at the present nor at a later or future time. While we were willing to contact earth leaders with certain reservations, for which you gave Le our demands so that he could pass them on to the US government. Contrary to our demands, however, Le brought you other and extremely arrogant demands to us, which were absolutely unacceptable to us and also corresponded to an impertinence. And that was because the demands made on us were so self-important and secretive and so cunning in terms of intelligence that it was not we, but the US administration, its secret services and military, that should have control and power over our contacts with the USA, which, of course, we could not accept. We were, and are, no supplicants, but we offered help and an alliance that would ultimately have brought the United States of America, and later also the Soviet Union, and all of humanity on Earth lasting world peace and immeasurably valuable technical and medical progress. As I have already said, we were not pleaders at that time, but rather our effort was that of a cooperative and helpful alliance, in which a few days later, if the alliance had been formed with those responsible for the US state, the Soviet Union would also be included, and then gradually all the other countries of the world. the alliance would first have led to efforts for global peace that would have led to lasting world peace within a few years. But this was obviously not in the interest of the state powers, the secret services, and the US military, because they all held on to their positions of power in relation to their power to govern and were unwilling to restrict them for the benefit of the US and the entire world population and for genuine world peace. And the fact that there was no will to respond to our peaceful demands was clearly demonstrated in response to our question in the US reply, which was, on the one hand, sneaky and to an extent impossible for us to meet.
Your effort would have been the chance for all humanity on Earth to finally win a real and lasting world peace. However, this was not in the interests of the US powers and their supporters, nor, therefore, of the secret services and the military of all kinds. But deceit and lying as well as intrigue and crime also belong to their profession, as is also the case with NASA, which claims to this day and therefore lies that the fictitious moon flight with Apollo 11 took place on July 20, 1969. Consequently, only the real flight with Apollo 12 took place, after which a next official landing on the moon took place on November 19, 1969. The alleged Apollo 11 missile, as you explained at the time, was launched, but without a crew, after which the landing capsule was blown off and returned to Earth, while the astronauts remained on the ground and under hypnosis or post-hypnotic influence experienced the alleged moon adventure. With a later moon flight, it was probably with the Apollo 13 on April 11, 1970, a manned moon landing actually took place, during which then the traces were set, which are supposed to have been made by the Apollo 11 moon landing. Thus a second lie arose, because officially it wasn't still as claimed today that on the way to the moon because of an explosion on board the Apollo spaceship the landing would have had to be cancelled and therefore only half a moon orbit with subsequent return to Earth had been carried out. After returning to Earth, as you told me, the crew was also treated post-hypnotically with a false memory, following which they were given a false pretense and a false memory that they had just circumnavigated the moon.
That is correct, but in this respect it should not be necessary to talk about it again.
You also had in mind that the whole thing should become official if everything had worked out, but what was messed up by the USA probably cannot be repaired and not repeated, or am I wrong?
This is also correct, and you are not mistaken, because through the whole we have clearly recognized that it will be impossible for the rulers of the Earth, and also for the majority of mankind on Earth to maintain contacts with us players for a very long time to come. But what will happen when the strangers who have been moving in earthly space for a long time or others who will appear sooner or later, which will only be a question of time, is still open and will become an event that will certainly bring many problems for the whole Earth, humanity. It must also be clear that strangers or future Earthlings do not have to be the same as us human beings, for various strangers to the Earth are beings who are not human and also not peaceful.
You told me that several times in private conversations, but what you said that it shouldn't be necessary to talk about the fake moon landing and the alleged moon, that's probably true. It just came to my mind because of the lying that the US also does in political matters, and precisely because of your machinations with the matter when you tried to communicate with the US administration through law. But now I have a question about serial killers, because a television show recently said that they might be treatable, but I doubt it.
Your doubts are justified, because people who appear as serial killers for pathological reasons cannot be treated at all, so that they cannot be cured of their pathological compulsion.
The Earth psychologists, as well as the entire psychiatry, are still very limited, which is why they let themselves be duped by serial killers and also by other kinds of murderers and be deceived by them, after which they let them run in the free passage or release them again into freedom, whereby then new murders are committed. But I don't mean people who are simply in affect, out of despair or unconscious derangement, etc. killing fellow men, but effectively only degenerate murderers.
Your words clearly interpret what you mean.
What about people who kill several people in wars, etc., as soldiers, etc.?
Insofar as they do not fall ill with it, thought, feel psychconsciously, or even break, but are accompanied by killing in indifference or in lust or joy, then killing people remains a permanent and dangerous state, which can degenerate into a killing on every corresponding occasion or situation, whereby this state remains lifelong. Many people, if they are conscientious and become so involved in acts of war that they really have to kill other people because they are forced to do so by state laws, very often suffer lifelong psychological damage.
That's what I thought it might be like. Then here's the thing. A person does not necessarily have to be psychopathically inclined or a full-grown psychopath to be able to kill another person, just as psychopaths do not necessarily have to kill. Or am I wrong?
What you are saying is right, because psychopaths can control themselves despite their disposition and keep themselves free from such acts, while people who are completely normally predisposed are also able to kill other people, whereby various motives can be given for this, which, however, are usually based on degenerations that cannot be controlled by those who kill. However, if this is jealousy, hatred, revenge or retribution, then the most diverse motivations that appear in a normal person are out of the question, because jealousy, hatred, revenge or retaliation are emotionally psychopathically determined.
Aha, then one could say that, for example, death penalty advocates are emotional psychopathic and thus somehow psychopathically inclined in some form?
One could not only say that, but it actually corresponds to a form of psychopathy.